This is an introduction to the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses. Get started. This is Zeus, also known as Jupiter, and he's also sometimes known as Jove. So when you read Ovid's Metamorphosis, you'll see him referred to as Jove. Remember that they are all the same person. But Zeus is god of the sky, he's god of rain and clouds and thunder. And you often see these in statues or imagery of the gods and goddesses. You see them depicted with certain attributes or things that are surrounding them, animals or trees holding specific things, so that you know exactly which god or goddess it is. So Zeus often is depicted with an eagle next to him, as you see in this one instance here. Sometimes an oak or an olive tree. He usually has his lightning bolt in his hand. So here we have Poseidon, the Greek name, Neptune, of course being the Roman name. His son is Triton, so if you're a Little Mermaid fan, King Triton is Poseidon or Neptune's son. He's the god of sea. He is also the god of earthquakes and floods. And a strange one, perhaps, is horses. He is the god of horses as well. So you often see him with that trident, which is the three-pronged spear that he's carrying there. He is sometimes pictured with a horse or a bull, a golden car, which you might picture, again, if you're picturing the Little Mermaid, he's often brought in on some kind of a golden chariot tugged by sea creatures. So that's the golden car that we're talking about. Sometimes dolphins or other sea animals, and a pine tree or sea celery. So in this statue, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see kind of a dolphin's tail whipping up there to the right of him. Next we have Hades, or Pluto, as he's known in the Roman. And Hades is an interesting figure in one of the myths because he weds Persephone. He steals her first and then he weds her. But he is the god of the underworld, as we know. He is also the god of wealth and precious metals. Precious metals make sense, of course, because you often have to dig for them underground. And so he is the god of all things that reside under the earth. As you see in this image here of the statue, he is pictured here with the Cerberus, the three-headed dog. And if you're a fan of the Harry Potter series, you're familiar with Fluffy, the three-headed dog, being an ode to the Cerberus here. He usually is pictured with kind of a two-pronged spear, so whereas Poseidon has the trident with three prongs, Hades has sort of an iteration of that where it's a trident missing the third prong in the middle, so it's sort of a pitchfork. I guess it's an early pitchfork, really, but it's a two-pronged spear. You can tell here many of these old statues that they're missing limbs, they're missing whatever's being held in their hand, but that seems to be what's missing from this statue here. And Hades has the invisible helmet, the helmet of invisibility. That is the special gift of his. So we keep going here. Apollo is an incredibly important god. He's known as Apollo in both Greek and Roman myths. Sometimes he's known as Phoebus Apollo or just Phoebus in both of the myths. But Apollo is a figure who has a lot to do in both of the myths. He's called upon often. Here he is seated in the middle with his nymphs. He's often pictured with a lyre, which is L-Y-R-E, which is a kind of musical instrument that's sort of like an early handheld harp. He's the god of music and of poetry. He's also the god of prophecy, and so whenever you see movies and they're talking about the Temple of Apollo, it's because he is the god of prophecy, and so that's where the priestesses would live. That's where people would go to pay homage to the god Apollo. He is the seeker of truth, and he is also in the divine art of healing. He's the god of the divine art of healing. So he cares about all of those things, and he's often pictured, like I said, with a lyre, sometimes with his bow and arrow, a laurel, so the crown on his head, as well as a crow or a raven. He is the twin brother of Artemis. So Artemis is his sister. They're often depicted in later iterations of myth as the sun and the moon. So Artemis or Diana is the moon, whereas Apollo is the sun god. So Artemis or Diana in the Greek, in the Roman, she's the virgin huntress. She's the goddess of hunting. She's the goddess of the wilderness, of wild animals, and she's also the goddess of children, because she has this kind of innocence. She's often pictured as she is here with her bow and arrow and a deer, sometimes a bear, sometimes a cypress tree, and of course she's often depicted as the goddess of the moon. When we look at Aphrodite or Venus, as Botticelli's famous painting here, The Birth of Venus, shows us, it's not hard to see that she is the goddess of love and beauty and, of course, sexual attraction. Venus and Aphrodite have quite an interesting origin story in the very earliest of the stories, which we are, of course, reading from, Hesiod's Theogony. She is born from Ouranos' genitals, so when Kronos castrates his father, and his genitals are thrown into the sea, that's what she comes from. Is depicted here arriving on the seashell on the shores. She's often depicted with a conch shell or a seashell of some kind of myrtle, which is a sea tree, a dove, a sparrow, a swan, or roses. Those are often the kinds of imagery that surround Aphrodite. She winds up being the lover of Hephaestus later, and we'll talk about that in a second. Athena, Pallas Athena, sometimes she is known as Pallas, and Minerva. She has an interesting origin story as well. In some of the earliest myths, she is known as coming directly from Zeus, sometimes said to have popped right out of the top of Zeus's head. But in another version of the myth, it is said that Athena is the child of Zeus and his first wife, named Metis, Metis. Now, we're not actually reading about this, but it is quite an interesting story, especially if you think about how Kronos was in trouble for swallowing his children. Zeus got a similar prophecy, and so he swallowed his first wife, Metis, and Metis is living in his belly. And so Metis was apparently pregnant with Athena whenever he swallowed her, and out pops Athena as the spawn of the two of them. So kind of an interesting story there. But Athena, Minerva, as we know, she's the goddess of wisdom, but she's also the goddess of war, and that makes it interesting because she winds up being the lover of Ares, the god of war. Makes for an interesting match there. She's also the goddess of weaving and crafts and agriculture, which all makes sense. She's often depicted with an owl, so the wise owl, an aegis, which is the shield that you see here. She has her spear and her shield, her helmet. That helmet she is usually wearing in depictions of her, and an olive tree. This is Hera, or Juno, and Hera is, of course, Zeus's wife, though it's hard to believe that she stays with him after all. She is the goddess of marriage, she is the goddess of the sky, and she is the goddess of women. She's often seen holding a scepter, which we can see has been broken off, but she is holding it in her hand. And she's often depicted holding that scepter, or having a peacock, a cow, or a lion somewhere around her. And you can see from this that she's got this headdress on. When women are seen wearing veils like this in statuary from early Greek depictions of the goddesses, it means that they have a husband. It's like when we see Zeus and Poseidon and Hades with the bearded figures. It's a signifier in art history here. Next, I wanted to throw in Demeter and Persephone. Though we're not really reading the myth of Demeter and Persephone, it's probably something that you've come across before. Demeter, of course, is the goddess of the harvest. She's the goddess of grains, and she's usually depicted carrying a stalk of wheat. So Demeter and Persephone have this interesting story about Persephone being stolen by Hades and taken into the underworld. Demeter creates a famine on the world because she's the goddess of the harvest and she's looking all over the place for her daughter. And of course, Hades tricks Persephone into eating pomegranate arrows to get her to stay with him in the underground, and we kind of get a story about how the seasons were created. Next we have Hermes, or as he's known in Rome, Mercury. He's the god of travel. He is a messenger god. He's also known as the god of athletes and the god of thieves, so being fleet-footed. He often has the caduceus, as we see in this. He has his winged sandals on. Also, we see that here. He usually has really fast animals depicted with him. So the hare, the rabbit, the hawk, or the crocus flowers. Those are things that are usually depicted when we see Hermes and Mercury. Hephaestus, who is also known as Vulcan and Mulciber in the Roman myths. He's the lover of Aphrodite, and he's the god of fire. He's the god of smithing, he's the god of metalworks, and the god of volcanoes and things. Hephaestus is a part of that. He's often depicted with his hammer and tongs and donkey, because if you have seen an old-school blacksmithing shop, you know that donkeys are used to pull some of the things around the shop. And he is usually depicted as seated because of an injury. He's also known as the lame god. And just a couple more here. We have Ares, Mars. He's the lover of Athena, and he's the god of war, courage, and battle lust. Anytime somebody wants to take revenge on somebody and wants to start a battle, that's Ares' job right there. He's often depicted with a vulture, some kind of a dog, and a serpent. We have Dionysus, and for any of you who are fans of Jim Morrison and the Doors, you may or may not know that Jim Morrison thought that he was a reincarnation of Dionysus, who is the god of wine, festivity, and madness. And this statue here appears at the Palace of Versailles. I thought that it was quite beautiful, so I thought I'd use it. Dionysus, or Bacchus, as he is known in the Roman. There's a cult of Dionysus. All kinds of interesting things to read if you're interested in him. We're not reading too much about him, but he's often depicted with a pine cone staff, a serpent, a bull, a panther, grapevines, and ivy. And finally, I wanted to show you Prometheus, who we will be reading a story about, and his name means forethought. He is the brother of Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, and after you read the story, I think you'll know why. There's a couple of different stories about his rescue. One story has him being rescued by Io. One story has him being rescued by Heracles. He's the creator of man in one story. He is the bringer of fire. He's usually depicted in chains, as he is here. He's usually depicted in the famous story of his liver being pecked out by eagles, and in pictures where he is not chained up, he is typically depicted holding a fennel stalk, which is how he brought fire down from Olympus to the humans. So hopefully you have enjoyed this presentation on the Greek and Roman Pantheon.